Islam, like any other complex religion, is subject to different forms of interpretation. So if you roll the clock back 50, 75 years, in the Middle East, everybody was a secular nationalist.
Right.
You know, there were no suicide bombers, there was none of this, you know, absurd jihadism. Rather, you had people like Nasser, or the early Baathists, who were, you know, suppressing the Muslim Brotherhood.
Let's talk a little bit about the Middle East, both on its own terms and as a problem for U.S. foreign policy and indeed for the world. How do you rate the chances of liberal democracy developing in the Middle East? You've written about this several times, and
Yes.
you've been a little bit ambivalent, I'd say, in your judgments. How do you view it now?
Well, from the perspective of 2015, I don't think we're going to see democracy break out in, you know, places like Egypt or Yemen anytime soon. Syria is, you know, total disaster. Of all of the countries in that region, only Tunisia seems to have some chance of actually producing a, you know, a relatively liberal democracy. And I think, you know, the challenges are pretty great. I think that you had this initial mobilization.
So what happened to the Arab Spring?
Yeah. Well, so the Arab Spring, I still think, laid a foundation for the possibility of democracy, because you can't have democracy if people aren't mobilized and angry and want to get rid of tyranny. And I think you saw that in one Arab country after another. But, and this kind of gets to the theme of my books, you can't have democracy without institutions. So Libya today is, it's basically a bunch of militias, guys running around with AK-47s shooting each other. There's no state. And so the first thing that they need to do is actually develop a state that has a monopoly of force and that can protect citizens from this kind of depredation. You need political parties, and I think to this day in Egypt, it's not clear to me that there weren't more people that would favor a more liberal, Western-oriented government than the ones that voted for the Muslim Brotherhood. But the problem was the Muslim Brotherhood was extremely well organized, and all the liberals ended up fighting each other, and they lost, you know, the presidential and parliamentary elections early on as a result. And so that, again, is a failure of institutions to defend.
I mean, that's a striking claim. Let's just analyze that for a second. I mean, typically you see figures that the liberal element, you know, students and the rising middle class is small, 10%, 15% or something at most of the electorate, if you want to call it that, in Egypt. But you think it's much? You think it's larger?
I think that if you looked at, for example, the election that brought Morsi to power, you know, part of the problem was the non-Islamist opposition was quite severely divided.
Right.
And if you added up, you know, the other, you know, candidates, it's not clear they couldn't have won a majority. But, you know, the Islamists in all of these countries, they've been driven underground, and as a result, they're tough, they know how to organize, and they also appeal to a kind of less educated rural population. And, you know, unfortunately, the people that we tend to like better, you know, the more liberal types they're more urban, educated, and they don't know how to make connections to that part of the population. So I think that was one issue. But then, you know, there's just the issue of the radicals. You know, there's no question that there's something in the contemporary, you know, interpretation of Islam that is breeding beheadings and suicide bombers and so forth. Now, that segment of, you know, the Muslim world is, you know, it's a sliver, but it's an important one because they can drive fear, and you know, they're well organized, and unfortunately, you know, that's the threat that we've got to deal with right now.
Well, let's pursue that a little. In your analysis, which has been consistent and well wrought over a number of years now, is that the problem of Islamism, or these fanatical subgroups of Muslims isn't really a true product of Muslim religion or culture so much as it's a strictly modern phenomenon washing over into the Middle East. That you've said that Islamism appeals mostly to urbanized Middle Easterners and sort of deracinated Muslim immigrants in Europe who are looking for a way to ground themselves, to root themselves,
That's right.
to finding an identity. And does that thesis cause problems for what you just said, however, that there's a fertile movement, a kind of ideology of sorts that is recruiting and imperiling
No, I
progress
think
in the Middle East?
those two are two sides of the same coin. I mean, there's definitely a very radical, dangerous ideology, and it appeals to a certain kind of person. So if you look at all these fighters that are now going to work for ISIS or fighting Assad in Syria, they're mostly unemployed young men without girlfriends, without much in terms of career opportunities. They're deeply alienated, and that's why they see that there's a cause that's larger than them, that they can belong in this society in a way that they couldn't belong in Amsterdam or Paris or wherever they started out. So I do think that there's a kind of sociological basis for the kind of extremism that we're seeing. I think the larger point that I've been trying to make is that Islam, like any other complex religion, is subject to different forms of interpretation. So if you roll the clock back 50, 75 years in the Middle East, everybody was a secular nationalist.
Right.
There were no suicide bombers. There was none of this absurd jihadism. Rather, you had people like Nasser, or the early Baathists, who were suppressing the Muslim Brotherhood. So I just think that these religious traditions are complex and they're just subject to reinterpretation with every generation.
Well, this I wanted to contrast your view of this with that of your teacher at Harvard. I mean, Sam Huntington is famous for one of his later books, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. That was 1996. And his argument was that there's something about Islam itself as a kind of civilization that is difficult for liberal democracy to digest. And hints that his prediction was along the borders of Islam with the rest of the world there would be conflict, which prediction has held up at least reasonably well.
Right.
So why are you right and he was wrong?
So certainly in the short run, he is correct that, I think of all the cultural groups that he referred to, or the civilizations, Islam is the one that actually believes that it's a civilization. Like the Chinese don't think that they're part of Confucian civilization. They're citizens of China or Singapore or Taiwan or whatever. But there is a sense in which Muslims do believe that there's a Muslim ummah, a community that transcends particular nation states. And it is true that separation of mosque and state has been, it has existed historically in medieval Islam, but in recent years it's been much more fused. And that's really, I think, the core of the political problem that these Islamist movements face or pose. But the question down the road is this a permanent, essential characteristic of Islam that will never be overcome under any circumstances? And I just think that if you look at the history of Christianity and democracy, there's some ground for thinking that that's not the case, because, in some sense, modern liberalism arose out of the sectarian wars within Christianity that were fought in the 16th, 17th centuries.
Yes, not the Crusades, as the
Crusades.
President said the other day.
No.
I mean, he really should have invoked the 16th and 17th centuries.
Well, the 30 Years' War in Germany killed, maybe a third of the population of Germany at that time. And I think part of the reason that you had the principle of tolerance spread in Europe was the fact that everybody was just tired of this after 150 years of unremitting warfare. And they said, well, the better principle is just to let people privately exercise their religious beliefs and have the state be neutral with regard to that. And so I think what's going on now in the Middle East is you're having a spreading Sunni-Shiite war that is going to be extremely costly, and it's possible at the end of this.
And prolonged.
And prolonged, yeah. I hope it doesn't go on for 150 years, but at the end of this, it may be the case that people will step back and say, hey, how about some liberal tolerance instead of, the sectarian definition of politics?
And that brings me to the second sort of questions I wanted to put to you, which is, what do we do? I mean, problems like Libya or Somalia or Yemen, where you have failed states, the solution used to be empire as a way of governing them against their will or without their consent. That seems to have gone out of style. And so what does that leave us as a foreign policy?
Well, it's a very tough question. I think that the experience of Iraq and Afghanistan have really demonstrated that the United States just does not have the kind of collective willpower to really dictate a political outcome in that part of the world, meaning, we wanted to create a modern, corruption-free democracy. We got the democracy part to some extent, but we certainly didn't get the modern state part in the low levels of corruption. I mean, what we've created are these two basically rent-seeking, monstrosities in a certain sense that are not capable of really providing impersonal, public services.
You're referring to the state apparatus.
The state apparatus, right. So I think we ought to, draw a lesson from that it might have been possible if the United States had been willing to occupy these countries for 50 years and, put lots of boots on the ground and spend a lot of treasure, both in terms of lives and dollars, but we're just not willing to do that. And so my view is that we ought to have a much more modest policy of containment, where we want to prevent certainly these terrorists from, doing things, attacking targets in our part of the world, and we should try to, make sure that they don't overrun more decent communities, the Kurds and other places. But I think we should just admit to ourselves that we don't have the staying power or the wisdom really to really dictate a solution in a place like Syria.
Do we have the right to do that if we did have the wisdom and willpower?
That bothers me a little bit less. I mean, I think that you do have situations where the United States has exercised, a lot of kind of judgment in the kinds of institution. We certainly did that in, places like Taiwan and Japan and South Korea after 1945, and I think they turned out pretty decently. But here it's much more a question of capability. I just don't think that we have the ability to bring that kind of result about in these places.
And is that primarily an intellectual failing, or is it simple exhaustion?
It's both. In fact it's that plus a lack of incentive. In Germany, Italy, Japan, Korea, we were fighting a Cold War, and that's why we stayed as long as we did. We thought that we had a very strong strategic interest. It's not clear we've got a similar strategic interest in a place like Syria. It's certainly a question of knowledge and wisdom. I mean, we just don't understand the politics in these places, and we don't have, I just think we don't have the local knowledge that's necessary for doing that. And then we are exhausted. I think that, these two long wars have made the American public pretty leery of getting involved in another one.
So why did the occupations of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan go so much better than the occupations of Iraq or Afghanistan? There was the Cold War emerging at the time.
But I think the most important difference was that these were already developed countries. That's why we were fighting them. I mean, they're very powerful, industrialized, modern countries with modern states. And the problem in both places was not to construct these modern institutions from the ground up. It was to basically get them going again, to prime the pump and get the state machinery working. And that, in both cases, happened within 5 years of their defeat. I think that was really the main reason.
You were critical of some neoconservative thinkers, although you yourself once were a neoconservative, or were happy to be, I guess, included in that in the circle. And your argument was that the young neoconservatives had forgotten their elders' criticism of massive social engineering projects. Has the second generation learned that lesson, do you think?
Well, I don't want to cast any particular aspersions, but I think that it still probably hasn't been absorbed, sufficiently. I just think that, the public interest that Irving Kristol published for many years, a great journal primarily about domestic American social policy, was all about caution with regard to what you can expect from, interventions, public policy interventions. And I think you consider trying to do something even more massive in a distant part of the world that we don't really understand, that is culturally very different. I think there was a tremendous amount of hubris in thinking that we could really engineer these kinds of outcomes. And I would say that, to this day, there's still an overestimation of, for example, could we actually settle the Syrian conflict and bring about some kind of a decent outcome in that situation? And I think there's still some neoconservatives that think we can, and I just don't believe that's possible.
In explaining their optimism or over-optimism, they sometimes, of course, would cite Frank Fukuyama, whose guarantee of universal liberal democracy seemed to suggest to them that it would be easy, once you got rid of the bad old government, to have a market economy and a liberal democratic political structure spring up from the earth.
That was a misunderstanding. I think that what's missing there is the difficulty of creating institutions, that liberal democracy is not the default form of government that simply arises wherever you get rid of a dictator. And that's really the central point of these two books that I've written, is that these institutions are really hard to create.
So you're expiating their sins, if not your own. All right, thank you.